All right. Okay, hello. All right. Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us. This evening's webinar is Where Did Anti-Semitism Come From? Teaching the History of European Anti-Semitism. Tonight, you will see primary sources and learn about historical details that outline the larger context of anti-Semitism to provide content that will help students understand its origins and history, in addition to how it has persisted in modern-day expressions. My name is Yasmin Forbes, and I am the lead curriculum specialist at the National Council for History Education. With me tonight is this evening's presenter, Liz, who is an Institute for Curriculum Services, or ICS, educator who taught for 15 years in independent and religious schools in New York, Connecticut, and New Jersey. As chair of an interdisciplinary humanities department, she served as a coach for teachers of social studies, ELA, world languages, fine arts, and religious studies. She holds a BA in religious studies from Fairfield University and a master's degree from the University of Notre Dame. So, without further ado, I will turn it over to Liz for her presentation.
Thank you so much, and I'm very excited to be here. I did put a sign-in link in the chat if you'd like to let us know that you're here. And without further ado, I'll share a little bit about who ICS is and what we do before we dive into the heart of our session today. So ICS is a nonprofit education organization, and our mission is that we are dedicated to improving the quality of K-12 education on Jews, Judaism, and Jewish history in the United States. And we do this in a couple of ways. We develop standards-aligned resources, and then you can access those all on our website, and I'll share those at the end. And we also provide professional learning experiences to teachers all around the country, whether through partner organizations, schools, districts, etc. Because we want to make sure not only do teachers know the content, but they have some strategies to teach this content. We believe that an excellent education is essential to building a strong civil society where all people can flourish. And we love a good primary source. I'm very proud that we are members of the Library of Congress's Teaching with Primary Sources Consortium, a distinction that we received after going through a rigorous application process. And it is really a highlight for us because we firmly believe that primary sources really help students think critically and independently when they're making meaning out of both historic events and current events. As we begin our learning tonight, I just wanted to share a couple of norms. I'll ask that you participate actively, to respect others' opinions, to hold space for open-mindedness, and to use professional language and behavior in the chat as we are communicating together. It's an interactive session. If there is anything that you would like to amend with this, please go ahead and add that in the chat, anything that you might want to add or remove, and I'll keep an eye on the chat for that as we keep going. Okay, so our objectives today. I'll start by saying that Holocaust education is integral to learning. It teaches the lesson that national or ethnic or racial or religious hatred can overtake any society, any nation, leading to catastrophic consequences. But students are often left with an unclear picture of how anti-Semitism developed before the Holocaust took place. So it's like we're dropping them into a story at chapter 25 without any of the context that came before. So these resources were originally created because we were hearing from teachers that they were getting questions from their students like, why did the Holocaust target Jews? How? Did Hitler invent anti-Semitism? And so on. And it was from those questions that we realized, oh, there's an important element, an important component of Holocaust education that's missing, understanding the origins of anti-Semitism. So that is the main objective of our workshop this evening. We set out to create a learning opportunity for teachers and students that would define anti-Semitism, that would contextualize its ancient beginnings, that would identify and examine 4 forms of anti-Semitism, and would enable them to recognize modern expressions of those historical forms. Now, we're only here for an hour. This is not a complete look at anti-Semitism's history. It is important for you and for your students to understand that there are different manifestations of anti-Jew hate in different times, in different places, not just Europe. But for the purposes of addressing those student queries, the materials that we have today are aiming to provide that historical context about the origins of anti-Semitism in Europe. And hopefully this will provide a greater understanding for you about the longevity and persistence and impact of this form of hatred. Now, you will receive a specially curated set of resources at the end of this workshop, but I am sharing a lesson plan with you now in case you'd like to follow along. I'm also going to share a note catcher in case that is something that would be helpful to you. There is a lot of content that we'll be working through this evening. When you click on the link that I shared in the chat or use that QR code, it will take you to a page that looks like this. And then once you click on it and click make a copy, you'll see a page that looks like this. So if the note catcher is something that would be helpful to you as you organize your learning, please feel free to use that. Let's begin our learning this evening with the definition of anti-Semitism. It's important to have a firm grounding here because we'll be looking at a variety of historic and modern examples. And there are many definitions of anti-Semitism, but they all come down to the same thing: hatred, discrimination, fear, and prejudice against Jews based on stereotypes and myths that target ethnicity, culture, religion, traditions, right to self-determination, connection to the state of Israel. And anti-Semitism or anti-Jew hate does manifest still with alarming regularity. Now I'm going to pause here to point out that there have been many names for the Jewish people through time, but this definition uses the word Jews. Jews is the accurate group name for the Jewish people as an ethnic and religious group from 722 BCE up until the present day. It's not a dirty or a scary word as long as it is used correctly. Now, how do you write the word? If you write it in Microsoft Word or Google Docs and you haven't set up a custom dictionary, you'll see that you'll get a little squiggly red line under anti-Semitism when it's spelled without a hyphen. But this is the most accurate way to write the word without a hyphen. When anti-Semitism is written without a hyphen, it reminds us that from the beginning, it's a word that has referred specifically and exclusively to the hatred of Jews. But when anti-Semitism is written with a hyphen, it can imply some inaccurate things. It can imply that there's such a thing as Semitism to which people can be opposed. That's not a thing. It can imply that anti-Semitism, the hatred of anti-Semitism, is directed to all speakers of Semitic languages. So speakers of languages like Hebrew, but also Arabic, Aramaic, Amharic. Anti-Semitism does not apply to all of those groups. And finally, it can imply that there's legitimacy to this 19th century pseudoscientific racial category of Semite. There is not legitimacy to that category. And then it can imply that the hatred described by anti-Semitism applies to all those deemed Semites according to this racist hierarchy. Not the case. So to best communicate that anti-Semitism is a word for anti-Jew hate, ICS, along with the US Holocaust Memorial Museum, the New York Times, the Associated Press, we all use this single word spelling, no hyphen. The term anti-Semitism made its way into the vernacular in 1879. So it's a relatively modern term. But the idea of viewing Jews as others spans all the way back to ancient times. And that's where we'll start. Jews, and by extension Judaism, originated around the 12th century BCE in the land of Israel, which is a region in the Eastern Mediterranean comprising the ancestral lands of the Jewish people in the ancient kingdoms of Israel and Judah. And Judaism, the religion of the Jewish people, is one of the oldest monotheistic religions in the world. And monotheism, or belief in one God, was a radical departure from the polytheistic beliefs that were prevalent in ancient times. And this difference in belief, as well as distinct religious practices, often set Jews apart from the societies in which they lived. And the earliest evidence of anti-Jewish sentiment goes back as far as the early 3rd century BCE, during the reign of Alexander the Great. During this time, the Jewish territory in the eastern Mediterranean was known geographically as Judea, and Alexander the Great ruled over Judea among the many other lands of his empire. And though Jews were allowed to practice their religion under Alexander's rule, the prevailing Hellenistic culture viewed Jewish customs like the rejection of Greek gods or weekly Sabbath observance or the practice of circumcision as anything from confusing to barbaric to evil. Now, in 63 BCE, Judea was conquered by the Roman Empire, and Rome installed kings in the region who ruled for them until 6 CE, when it officially became the Roman province of Judea. And this led to conflict with the Jewish inhabitants of Judea, who staged 3 major revolts against Roman rule. Now, at the end of the second of these rebellions, which lasted from 66 to 70 CE, the Romans destroyed the temple in Jerusalem, which had been the center of Jewish religious life in ancient times. After a final rebellion in 163 CE, Romans then expelled a large portion of the Jewish population from Judea. And later still, Roman Emperor Hadrian renamed the region of Judea to Syria Palestina after the Philistines, an ancient seafaring people who were historical enemies of the Israelites. Now, as a result of this expulsion, Jews became a diaspora. They lived as both physical and social outsiders, and their status as the perpetual other was reinforced. This was a very precarious situation because their safety and well-being was dependent on the tolerance of others. In the midst of all this upheaval, a new religion emerges on the scene. So Christianity emerged in the 1st century CE, and it is centered on the figure Jesus of Nazareth. And Jesus was born a Jew and practiced Judaism throughout his life. And during his life, and especially after his crucifixion by the Romans in the year 30 CE, a small movement grew up around his oral teachings. And these very earliest Christians continued to observe Jewish ritual law. But within 2 decades after the death of Jesus, the movement began to differentiate itself from its Jewish roots. And the way that it did this over the next few centuries, as Christianity became a separate religion from Judaism, the separation was founded in the belief that Christian teachings superseded or replaced Judaism and Jewish law. And this idea came to be known as replacement theology. It's basically the idea that Christianity takes precedence over the teachings of Judaism. Now, one way that we see this emerging is in ancient Christian commentaries on the scriptures. They call the Hebrew Bible the Old Testament as part of an argument that it has been replaced by a new and more accurate testament. And in the view of many early Christians, Jews were contemptible for not accepting Christianity. So now we'll jump ahead a little bit in time and look at how replacement theology was depicted in art. So what you see here are sculptures called ecclesia and synagoga, or church and synagogue. And they personify the church, Christianity. Ecclesia means church, and that symbolizes Christianity. Synagogue, symbolizing Judaism. This is a motif found in medieval Christian art, and these ecclesia and synagoga statues often appeared as large figures sculpted on either side of a church or a cathedral entryway. We're going to do a little bit of analysis of the image, so I'm going to drop a larger version in the chat. Now, we're going to do a little bit of the good old see, think, wonder strategy, and we're going to start by making concrete observations just about ecclesia, the figure on the right. So in the chat, if you could respond, what do you see when you look at the statue of ecclesia? We're only making concrete observations right now, no inferences or judgments at this time, just observations. I'll give you a few moments to add to the chat. Okay, so we have a cross, a cup, and you can even get more basic than that, that it's a female figure, that it's wearing a crown, that there's an kind of an open posture and a little bit more of a positive expression. Now let's shift to synagoga. What are some observations about synagoga? So I'm seeing in the chat, the most obvious difference is that her eyes are covered, right? Wearing a blindfold. You can also see that synagoga is wearing a crown, like ecclesia. She's holding different objects, though. She's holding what appears to be a book in one hand and some sort of broken object in the other. Okay. So now, with these observations, we can contrast these figures and think about, well, why is synagoga blindfolded? What is the importance of the items in the women's hands? And what message is being communicated by these sculptures? And from the blindfold, from the broken object, from the slumped over posture, you can see that the artist is trying to communicate that Judaism is an obsolete or flawed religion, perhaps blinded to the truth, and that Christianity is the more superior alternative in the view of the creators of this item. Now, the next and final step is to ask what the image makes you wonder. And if there are any questions, please go ahead and drop those in the chat. One question I'm frequently asked is, what is that broken object that synagoga is holding? And it could be a broken Torah scroll. It might also be, in other depictions, a reference to the lance that stabbed the side of Jesus on the cross. So all of these questions, as students are asking what they are, it's going to lead them to a better understanding of each religion and its history. The more questions they ask, the more they'll be able to learn and discover. And even though, once again, this image is not from the ancient world, it's a medieval image, it really, really is a clear depiction of replacement theology. Now, I'll pause here to point out that especially since World War II, various Christian denominations have shifted towards a more positive view of Judaism and have engaged in interfaith work. And this sculpture, which is called Synagoga and Ecclesia in Our Time, was a combined effort of various Catholic and Jewish groups in Philadelphia. And you can find it today on the campus of St. Joseph's University in Philadelphia. And it was actually blessed by Pope Francis in 2015. But now we'll go back to the ancient world. And as Christianity spread throughout the ancient Roman world, the social standing of Jews continued to deteriorate. And in 380 CE, Christianity was adopted as the official religion of Rome. Christianity was now part of the political power structure, and it was a unifying element for the empire, to the profound detriment of Jews. Judaism lost the legal protections that it once benefited from under Rome, and instead, laws were imposed that were designed to limit Jews religiously and economically. And in 438 CE, the Roman Empire codified these anti-Jewish laws in what is known as the Theodosian Code. So here are some of the laws that were enforced. And as you're looking at these laws, consider in the chat, what do these laws suggest about how Jews were viewed at the time? So according to the Theodosian Code, Jews were barred from serving in public office or serving in any official capacities. Intermarriage was permitted on penalty of death. The building of new synagogues was prohibited. Jews were prohibited from offering testimony in court against Christians, and Christians in turn were forbidden from converting to Judaism or attending Jewish worship services. So I'll give you a moment to consider what do these laws suggest about how Jews were viewed at the time? So I'm seeing in the chat incompetent, possibly also untrustworthy, and in some way also a threat. They're also like a danger. Christians are forbidden from even attending a Jewish worship service. You might also consider with your students when you're looking at these laws, you might ask them to think, what other prohibitions, what other sets of laws do these laws remind you of? Other periods in history. And this could be an entry point to talk about Jim Crow laws or the Nuremberg laws. But back to the ancient world again, even after the Roman Empire broke down in the 5th century, these laws lived on. Subsequent kingdoms and monarchs continued to use the legal codes of the Roman Empire. And this meant that the persecution of Jews and the anti-Semitic laws, which were originally implemented during the Roman Empire, continued from the ancient world into medieval Europe. And the Middle Ages is where the 4 historical forms of anti-Semitism that surface in Europe really begin to take shape. We'll trace how these grew and evolved so that we're better able to understand many of the discriminatory belief systems that Jews are challenged with today. And these 4 forms are religious, economic, political, and racial anti-Semitism. The first form of anti-Semitism that we're going to discuss is religious anti-Semitism, and that is prejudice against Jews based on the perception that Jewish religious beliefs and practices are harmful or pose a threat to society. And these religious rationalizations were used to justify oppression and used to justify violence. So in the early medieval period, Christianity, as we said, it was the dominant force not only in daily life, but political life as well. And depicting Jews as a threat was central to European culture. So for instance, Jews were seen as a threat to Christian purity. Jewish customs were seen as wicked or nefarious. Jews were directly associated with the devil and evil, and Jews were accused of deicide. That was the root of all of this. Jews were accused by the church, the church taught that Jews, not the Roman authorities, killed Jesus. Now, quick note about the deicide charge. We should note that since World War II, various Christian denominations have taken steps to disavow this deicide charge. To cite just one very clear example, in 2011, Pope Benedict XVI explicitly exonerated Jews from all blame for the crucifixion and death of Jesus in his book, Jesus of Nazareth. But beginning in the 13th century, there was the marginalization of Jews through social restrictions based on the false notion that Jews had corrupting qualities on Christians. So, for example, the Fourth Lateran Council, which was convened by Pope Innocent III in 1215, decreed that Jews needed to wear distinguishing garb in order that a Christian does not accidentally marry a Jew. In parts of Germany, this distinctive dress took the form of cone-shaped hats, and in other areas, they were required to wear yellow badges. You see in this image with the man and the woman. And these yellow badges were almost 730 years before the Holocaust. Additionally, it became common practice for Jews to be forced in separate areas of towns, to be excluded from all activities of mainstream society. And these Jewish quarters, which were commonly referred to as ghettos, were often gated and locked at night. And the English word ghetto is believed to be derived from the Italian word giotto, meaning foundry, because the first Jewish quarter in Venice was near a foundry that once made cannons. So this could be a really interesting time to discuss with your students the origin and evolution and perception of the term ghetto, not only in history, but in American vernacular, and to make any connections to their understanding of this term and the historical context of it regarding the segregation of Jews in Europe. Next, we'll zoom in on one of the ways that Jewish customs were misinterpreted as nefarious, and that's in a myth now known as blood libel. And echoing the Hellenistic idea that Judaism was a barbaric religion, blood libel is the false belief that Jews use Christians' blood for ritual purposes. And you can see depicted in this rather graphic image one of the most famous blood libel cases, and that is the case of Simon of Trent. And Simon was born in the Italian city of Trent in 1472. And when he was a toddler, he disappeared. This disappearance was blamed on one of Trent's Jewish families. And as a result, several of the town's prominent Jews were arrested and tortured until they confessed to ritually murdering young Simon. The official argument against them was that the city's Jews had performed a mock crucifixion, had stolen the boy's blood, and then disposed of his body. And as a result of this false accusation, 15 Jews were sentenced to death and burned at the stake. And this false notion continued to spread across Europe, and it turned into various permutations. So Christians also began to believe, for instance, that blood from Christian children was needed as an ingredient in the making of matzah, the ritual bread that Jews eat during the holiday of Passover. The use of wine during the Passover meal lent credence to this in Christians' mind, to the idea that blood was involved. But the end result was, if a child went missing, it was often Jews who were blamed. And these early blood libel myths did not stay only in the past. They've had a lasting effect on the perception of Jews that continues even to today. This is on the screen an excerpt from the manifesto of a mass shooter who, on the last night of Passover in 2019, walked into a synagogue in San Diego, California. He wounded 5 people and killed 1 other. And in his manifesto, he wrote, "You are not forgotten, Simon of Trent. The horror you and countless children have endured at the hands of the Jews will never be forgiven." Now, I'll pause here to note that in addition to the historical primary sources that I'm mentioning, all of which and more you will have access to at the end of the workshop, we also have a gallery walk of modern anti-Semitism. So this example of this mass shooter's manifesto is one of many that are included to help students make connections between historical events and the present day. Okay, so blood libel was something that was easy for Christians to believe, in part because of the way that Jews were depicted in the broader culture. Since many people couldn't read during the medieval period, art played a major role in how people learned about their religion and about others. So here we have a visual example of religious anti-Semitism in art from the time period. This is an engraving that is a replica of a painting on the bridge tower, the old bridge tower in Frankfurt, dating back to 1475. So I'll give you a moment to take a look at this image. What do you see or think you see when you look at this woodcut? Yeah, so there's a human body at the top. And this human body is arranged in the manner of the crucifixion. And it's actually intended to be a depiction of Simon of Trent, who we just learned about. So this is reinforcing that myth of blood libel. Now, when you look at the bottom, you'll notice there's a man on a boar riding it backwards. And then at the bottom, there's a man who is suckling at the pig's teeth. And this is a motif called the Judensau, or Jew's sow. And this is the name for a motif that's depicting Jews engaging in derogatory interactions with pigs. And it's a reference to the pig's perceived impurity. You'll also notice the circular badges. Okay. And we see the circular badges on all of the figures in this image. So we know that they're all Jews. This man, you can see, has horns. This man also has horns. There's some bestial imagery. And then up here, this figure has hooves, has animal legs, has the largest horns of all, right? The devil himself is depicted as a Jew, right? And depicting the devil as a Jew makes a clear distinction that Jews should be perceived as the ultimate evil. So before we move on, just take this opportunity to jot down any information that's standing out to you from this section on the ancient roots of anti-Semitism and the origins of religious anti-Semitism. Now, the second form of anti-Semitism that we'll be discussing is economic anti-Semitism. And the image of the greedy Jew may be the most enduring anti-Semitic stereotype of all. And this form of anti-Semitism emerged in the medieval period, and it's the belief that Jews perform harmful business activities, or that business activities become harmful when performed by Jews. And we'll look at how money lending and finance became identified as quote unquote Jewish occupations. So starting in the 11th century, many medieval European legal systems prohibited Jews from things like owning land, farming, joining craft guilds. And so many Jews turned to marginalized occupations, things like tax collecting, rent collecting, money lending on behalf of wealthier Christians, who would use Jews as middlemen in order to bypass the religious prohibition on usury or lending money at interest. So no one likes paying taxes. No one likes being in debt. No one likes paying their rent. And the Christian populace placed its resentment and hostility on the Jewish debt collectors rather than on the rulers who were enacting those taxes in the first place. And Christian leadership exacerbated this resentment by making Jews a scapegoat for the common person's financial troubles. And so eventually, usury and finance more generally became primarily identified as Jewish practices. And perhaps the most famous Jewish moneylender of all time is Shylock from The Merchant of Venice. If you're not familiar, during the play, Shylock lends money to the character Antonio on the condition that Shylock be repaid with a pound of flesh if Antonio defaults on the loan. Well, Antonio fails to pay his debt as Shylock becomes enraged and attempts to get the pound of flesh he was promised. And in the end, Shylock is forced to forfeit all of his possessions and convert to Christianity. So a clear example of the play's endorsement of forced conversion and intolerance towards Judaism. But what's most interesting and important to note is that there were basically no Jews living in England during Shakespeare's time. And there had been basically no Jews in England since they were expelled in 1290, over 300 years prior to the play. Nevertheless, Shakespeare knew his audience would understand the reference because the greedy Jewish merchant was already such a powerful and entrenched stereotype. And this imagery still holds resonance today. In 1821 and even up until 2002, productions of The Merchant of Venice have had the actor playing Shylock wearing a prop nose to exaggerate the perceived Jewish characteristic of a nose for profit. And the portrayal of the goblins who work at the bank in the Harry Potter movies also have all of the exaggerated features that have come to define this stereotype. So these images are really, really entrenched in our collective imagination. Anti-Semitic tropes have permeated our language as well, colloquial English. So, for example, to Jew down is a derogatory phrase that means to haggle or to bargain in hopes of getting a cheaper price. And It may seem harmless, but it reinforces the stereotype that Jews are stingy and greedy, and it's unfortunately very much a part of our mainstream lexicon. In February 2022, this was actually used in the Kentucky General Assembly. Two legislators used it in a hearing, and one of the representatives later said, when asked about it, said, "It's a phrase I've heard throughout my life," underscoring how pervasive this notion is. In a similar vein, you can see this is from December of 2022. Google actually had as their leading definition for the word Jew, a verb to bargain with someone in a miserly or petty way. Now, Google did quickly remove this offensive definition, but all of these examples from language show how pervasive economic anti-Semitism continues to be. So I'll give you a moment again to jot down what was notable to you when considering economic anti-Semitism. Now, the third form that we'll be unpacking is political anti-Semitism, and that is hatred, discrimination, and exclusion of Jews based on the perception that they pose a political threat. And this form of anti-Semitism often manifests with references to Jews wielding excessive power, Jews wielding excessive influence, with suggestions that Jews exploit their power and influence to advance their own agendas at the expense of others. And to understand the roots of this kind of anti-Jewish thought, we need to go back to the French Revolution and the rise of the modern nation state. And in the French Revolution, it was declared liberty, fraternity, equality. They're for all French citizens. But what about Jews? Are Jews really French or something else? Were they also entitled to political rights? This became known as the Jewish question, and the answer to that Jewish question started to take shape shortly after the revolution. In 1791, spurred on by the ideals of the Enlightenment, the Jews of France were emancipated, meaning political restrictions were removed and they could be seen as equals and participate fully in society. There were some conditions. In return, Jews had to make some changes to various aspects of their cultural and communal life. So Jews needed to stop using traditional Jewish names, to register their religious communities with the government, to refrain from using Hebrew or Yiddish in business transactions. And France was the first European country to do this, to emancipate its Jewish population, about 40,000 people. And within a century, French Jews emerged as eager and as sometimes very prominent citizens. And many other Western and Central European countries emancipated their Jewish population in subsequent years. But in Eastern Europe, emancipation was much slower and much more complicated. So before emancipation, the Tsarist government forced Jews to settle only in a certain area of Russia, the so-called Pale of Settlement. And most Jews lived there in great poverty, with only few members of the very small Jewish upper class who were permitted to live in cities like Moscow or St. Petersburg. And in contrast to Western Europe, which became more tolerant during the 19th century, discrimination against Jews increased in Eastern Europe during the 19th century. And that's because 19th century Russia was an autocratic society with difficult economic conditions. And as an outlet for the people's discontent, Russian authorities used Jews as a scapegoat. They encouraged anti-Semitic violence and riots known as pogroms. And as a result of these pogroms, about 2 million Jews left Russia between 1881 and 1914, primarily immigrating to the United States. And it was only with the Russian Revolution in 1917 that the Jews of Eastern Europe were finally emancipated. Now back to Western Europe. Only a few decades later, by the mid-19th century in Western Europe, the controversy around emancipation began to grow. You can take a look at this map of the Jewish population distribution to help provide a background to our conversation around emancipation in these areas. So, particularly in Western Europe, as Jews became successful in new professions, resentful members of society began to express the idea that Jews were stealing jobs that were previously reserved for Christians, or that Jews were overrepresented in important fields. So fields like law, journalism, medicine. As Jews became more politically active, others saw Jews as being proponents of radical and dangerous views. And as successful as Jews were in acculturating to their host societies, they did continue to stay connected to other Jews and to retain aspects of their cultural identity. So critics claimed that Jews reaped the benefits of emancipation while still being a separate group. And that connection to that separate group allowed them to be a threat from within to European society. And that threat from within is where we see the foundational thinking for political anti-Semitism, which is illustrated in the next slide. So this is a political cartoon, and it's from a German satirical magazine, Simplicissimus. And before I reveal the cartoon's translation, I'll just point out a couple of features. Okay. It looks like the same person, but their style is very exaggerated, clearly going from poor to middle class to elite. The exaggerated features are very prominent. So the very large nose is prominent. And it looks like this is like a pauper who's kind of transforming himself into something else. Now, with the translation, you can see that the cartoon is called Metamorphosis. And the translation reads, Moishe Pisha traded in Ternopil in discarded clothes. Then the second frame, as Moritz Wasserstrahl, he resettled in Posen and traded in Paris fashions. Then the third frame, now he lives as Maurice Lafontaine in Berlin, where he has founded a new art movement and trades in out-of-fashion Paris artworks. So we can see that this cartoon is really mocking the metamorphosis of an Eastern European Jew. The name changes, the clothing changes, they imply a desire not only to assimilate, but to become an elite member of society. Yet the changes are superficial, right? This cartoon is communicating a little bit of derision, more than a little bit of derision, because these changes are superficial. They don't alter this immutable and, in this perception, negative Jewish identity. And in the end, this cartoon is communicating a Jew will always be a Jew, no matter how much he assimilates. And it really, really is playing on caricatures, on anti-Semitic tropes prevalent in the late 19th century. It really disparages and mocks Jewish assimilation and social mobility. So there's this idea that the character in here is opportunistic and deceptive, which is common in depictions of political anti-Semitism today. Now, perhaps the most notorious and influential example of political anti-Semitism is the Protocols of the Elders of Zion, which was published in Russia in 1905. And this book claimed to be the record of a secret Jewish plot to cause the collapse of all Christian countries and to bring about Jewish world domination. Now, in truth, this book was a forgery by the Russian secret police. They were trying to undermine anti-Tsarist revolutionaries by spreading the belief that these revolutionaries were controlled by Jews. So, by 1921, there was clear public evidence that this book was a fraud. But nevertheless, it was extremely popular internationally. In the US, between 1920 and 1927, Henry Ford published the document in a serialized fashion in his newspaper, the Dearborn Independent. And the Protocols was also highly influential on Hitler and the Third Reich, and was even taught in schools in Nazi Germany in 1933. And even up to a more modern example, in 2002, Egypt's government-sponsored television station aired a miniseries based on the Protocols, which was condemned by the US State Department. But more than any other document, the protocols laid the foundation for the types of global conspiratorial claims that are leveled at Jews today. And again, these are anti-Semitic notions which are not limited to the past. So anti-Semitic flyers like this one on the screen have been found in cities throughout the US. This was kind of at the 2021 part of the COVID-19 lockdowns. This flyer blames the Jews for promoting COVID-19 restrictions and for the same kinds of claims that we saw in the protocols of the Elders of Zion. In this case, the presence of Jews in various organizations dealing with the pandemic serves as evidence that Jews as a whole were somehow the driving force behind it. Now, interestingly, some of the people on this flyer are not actually Jewish, but they were labeled as such for the convenience of the message. So they're perpetuating this form of anti-Semitism by implying Jewish influence on people who are not actually Jewish. Now, the website that's linked on this flyer also is contains a plethora of political anti-Semitism. There's a library of videos that accuse Jews of a range of treachery, from manipulating the COVID vaccine to controlling the media to being the force behind the military-industrial complex. Again, this is an example of the power of propaganda, and all of these can be traced back to the backlash to the European emancipation movement. And you'll also see a connection to religious anti-Semitism on this flyer. When you look at the top left, you see the Star of David, and it's juxtaposed with the pentagram on the top right, associating Jews with satanic worship. I'll give you a moment to jot down any thoughts about political anti-Semitism before we move on to the final historical form. And that final historical form that we'll look at is racialized anti-Semitism, which is prejudice or hatred of Jews as a supposed racial group that is perceived to be a biological threat to a more superior white race. And quotes or quotation marks are doing a lot of work here in this section. So political anti-Semites fear a Jewish political agenda for world domination. Racial anti-Semites fear and claim that there's a Jewish agenda for world racial domination. And this form of anti-Semitism can be traced back to the 19th century. So in 1859, British scientist Charles Darwin publishes The Origin of Species. So he's laying out this theory of evolution and natural selection. Racists and anti-Semites who already had ideas about racial hierarchies then combined it with Darwin's ideas about evolution in the natural world to scientifically argue that inferior and superior races evolved to support their belief in white superiority. Now, one of these people was a man named Wilhelm Marr, who popularized the term anti-Semitism in a pamphlet in 1879, where he's describing his racial opposition to Jews, and he's arguing for a hierarchy of races. And in his argument, at the top of this hierarchy are white Europeans or Aryans, and at the bottom of this hierarchy are the dangerous and alien race of Jews. So according to this view, there is no hope for assimilation. According to this view, Jews were born inherently different and inferior. Now, of course, these ideas are not and have never been true, right? Science tells us there's only one human race, and any biological differences we see between groups are only minor variations in things like skin color, hair texture, etc. That these ideas are, again, not true and have never been true. But this was the primary manifestation of anti-Semitism in Nazi Germany, and according to Nazi racial theory, Jews constituted a biologically inferior race, which was thought to corrupt the pure German Aryan stock through race mixing and intermarriage. And because of this, distinguishing between Jewish ancestry and those with quote-unquote Aryan ancestry was a matter of highest concern for Hitler and the bureaucracy of the Third Reich. So in 1935, the Nazi government passed the Nuremberg laws that restricted marriage and sexual relations between those deemed racially German, and those with Jewish backgrounds. As a part of this law, these laws, only Aryans could be citizens. That meant that Jews were stripped of their citizenship and denied their political rights. And without citizenship, you do not have a passport. And without passports, Jews' escape became much harder, if not impossible. And those deemed legally Jewish by blood also needed to self-identify with the now infamous yellow stars. And the Nazis took great pains to define who was and wasn't racially acceptable. And because the Nuremberg laws were based on a racialized understanding, these laws applied equally to religious Jews, to non-religious Jews, to converts from Judaism to other religions, to those who were not considered Jewish according to Jewish law, but had some degree of Jewish ancestry. And a year after these laws were passed, they were broadened to include those of Romani and African descent as well. Now, one of the primary sources that we include in our resources is this letter from Hitler to a fellow soldier during Hitler's time in the propaganda department, as a propaganda writer and informant, I should say. And this was written in 1921. What is really, really striking to note is that it builds on all of the types of anti-Semitism from this lesson, showing their interconnectedness and interrelatedness. And this is just one of many of the primary sources that you'll receive momentarily. So I'll invite you, as our time together comes to a close, is to think about any particular emotions or reactions or realizations that you experienced in the process of learning about the historical forms of anti-Semitism, and to think about how these reactions, these emotions, these realizations can inform your teaching and to make this information more meaningful for your students and for their learning. And while our focus today was on historic anti-Semitism, over time, anti-Semitism has still evolved and has still manifested in ways that don't neatly fit into one of the forms we've discussed. Today, we're seeing unprecedented levels of anti-Jew hate showing up in schools, in sports, in social media, all with the intent to hurt and to intimidate and marginalize Jews. This sign is just one example. The message "Jews not welcome" was spray painted on the entrance of a high school in Maryland in the middle of December 2022, on what happened to be actually the day before the first night of Hanukkah, a Jewish holiday celebrating the Jewish people's survival and resistance, and the reestablishment of their religious freedom after facing severe persecution, including the outlawing of Jewish practices and the desecration of the temple in Jerusalem and the forced worship of Greek gods under the Seleucid Empire. So a particularly painful time to see this message. One of the other ways that anti-Semitism has evolved and doesn't always align with traditional and historical forms involves understanding the complex relationship between Zionism and anti-Zionism and anti-Semitism. And this is likely something that you or many of your students have questions about, and you might be wondering how to approach them. We are a non-political education organization. We don't endorse a particular view. We can't tell you the answer to those questions, but we do have a resource that provides factual information and context. I will drop that in the chat for you now to help you with those questions that you may have. And at this point, we've reached the ends of our historical explorations of the origins and persistence of anti-Semitism. And to help your students engage with these historical forms, we have a gallery walk in PDF form with 14 examples of historic anti-Semitism and modern anti-Semitism as well. We also have a virtual gallery walk using a site called Genially. On this website, you can see various modern examples. You can click on each example, and there are discussion questions and background about that modern form of anti-Semitism. Okay. With that, I've reached the end of my portion of our time together. And so I have a couple of pieces of housekeeping before I turn it back over. The first is this evaluation. I hope you won't mind filling it out. Your time is an extremely valuable resource, and I want to make sure that we are using it at ICS. We're using it the best that we can, and being good stewards of it. I also want to share that we offer support for many content-driven topics that you can see here. And you can access all of our instructional materials and professional learning on our website. And then finally, a specially curated collection of resources related to this session can be found at the link on the screen and in the chat. So with that, I will say thank you so much, and I will turn it back over for some final notes.
All right. Thank you so much, Liz, for such an enriching presentation on the historic and present day examples of anti-Semitism. I know those in attendance or those watching the recording have walked away with something they can use themselves or with students to denounce anti-Semitism. In addition to all of the amazing resources that you can find on ICS's website about topics on the Jewish experience, we at NCHE have new teaching resources on various US and world history topics, one being Kristallnacht, Prelude to the Holocaust, which can be found on our website, which is in our newly curated database. I just dropped the link right there. And this particular teaching resource emphasizes the use of historical empathy, one of our 10 history habits to guide students as they learn about what took place on November 9th and 10th in 1938, when the Nazi regime coordinated a wave of anti-Semitic violence in Germany that came to be known as Kristallnacht, or the Night of Broken Glass. And I will also put a direct link to that resource in the chat as well. And before we officially close out, I wanted to extend an invitation to our upcoming webinars taking place within the next few months. And those can be registered for on our website here. And on November 18th at 7 p.m. Eastern is Homestead as Rescue, Black Homesteaders and the Lure of the Great Plains. And then on December 10th at 7 p.m. Eastern, we have Teaching the 250th Resources for Meaningful Commemoration. And on January 21st at 7 p.m. Eastern is From Kitchen to Screen, Food, Society, and the Stories of the Gilded Age. And like I said, you can register for those on the website. And thank you again to Liz, to ICS, and to everyone joining us this evening. And I hope that you have a great rest of your night.